Okay, welcome everybody. I'm so glad people are here and caring about this topic of how we're supporting our children in this globally mobile life. My name is Katie, and I work with international schools and with children who are having difficulty reading. And it's really exciting today to have Lauren Wells here. She's an author and founder of TCK Training. And this has been an especially tough year for our kids, right? With COVID, schools shutting down, kids moving country and not being able to say goodbye or make new friends in the virtual environment. Maybe there's been quick departures of countries or not being able to get back into your country. I think more this year too, what we've seen is governments opening schools and then closing schools. So there's been so much challenge on top of the already challenges that, moving around can have for our kids. So I'm so grateful that Lauren is here, and she is going to talk to us today about her experience as a TCK and the kind of support that she can give to children from her knowledge and from her experience. So Lauren, could you introduce yourself, and then maybe let's get into our first question. And our first question from our participants and from thinking about the book that, if you've had the opportunity to read, is Raising Up a Generation of Healthy Third Culture Kids, is about why is it important to talk about the concept of third culture kids and as part of our children's identity. And as one of our audience members asked too, when is labeling kids as TCK useful and when is it unuseful? So I guess three parts. First, who you are and why you care. The second part is, why is the concept of third culture kids so important as understanding part of our kids' identity? And when is this label useful and when could it not be? So
yeah, wonderful questions to get started with. So to introduce myself a bit, my name is Lauren Wells, and I am, like Katie said, the founder and director of TCK Training. And just thank you so much at the beginning, Katie, for hosting this and creating this opportunity for people to hear and be heard. So I love that we have this platform this morning. I am a TCK myself. I grew up in Tanzania, East Africa, and did a lot of going back and forth between Africa and California. So had a lot of transitions during that time. And I was definitely a TCK who was not well cared for. I had wonderful parents who were really wanted to be intentional, but they just didn't know how. We were with an organization that had never sent a family to live overseas, so they didn't have any sort of training, nothing to equip families. And I didn't even know that the term TCK existed until high school. And so that was definitely a helpful thing for me when I discovered what that was, and then decided that was going to be my career trajectory, is I wanted to help families really thrive while living overseas. And a lot of that is an awareness and intentionality on the part of the children, the kids. So I began TCK training about 3 years ago after working for about 10 years in TCK care. I worked pre-field training doing culture learning and language acquisition for families, and definitely had this belief when I was doing that and first starting it, that because we were doing culture learning and language acquisition, somebody else must be teaching these parents about parenting in other areas other than culture learning and language acquisition. And I was so surprised at the lack of parenting resources for families moving overseas. And so it really felt like I wanted to fill that gap. So like Katie mentioned, I've written a couple of books. I have this organization that I use to support families and support companies and organizations to help them know how to best support families. So that's a huge part of what I do, is working on the family side directly, and then also the organizational side so that they can be more equipped to help families thrive overseas. I am a parent myself, so I have that mom part under my belt as well. I have two little girls, Clara and Audrey, and we currently live in South Carolina, but we just moved here about a year ago. So we've had our own transition in the last year, which if you've had a transition during COVID, you know that that is not the easiest time to have any sort of a transition. To the questions. So Katie, you had asked about labeling TCKs as such and why it's important to know about TCKs and kind of the characteristics that come with that, some of the challenges, that sort of thing. Labeling TCKs is something that in some fields of TCK care, it's talked about as the primary label for your child. That's something that I don't agree with. I think in that school of thought, when we say first and foremost, you are a TCK.
Can you tell us, Lord, what TCK means? I can't remember.
Yeah, absolutely. So a third culture kid is what TCK stands for. And that just means that it's somebody who has lived outside their parents' passport country for the purpose of work or education or foreign service or missions, humanitarian work, anything like that. And the idea is that it's different than an immigrant or refugee because there is an intention of repatriation at some point. Obviously, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes you raise kids overseas, they decide to stay there, study there, get married there. That sort of thing, they would still be considered a TCK though, because there was some thought of we're coming here for a purpose and planning to return at some point instead of we're permanently moving here and that sort of thing. So that's what defines a third culture kid. There are a lot of really unique things about third culture kids. And for the first time ever, we have enough research to see what goes on with adult third culture kids to know that they really struggle in adulthood. There are statistics coming out about how 70 to 80% deal with a depression or anxiety disorder in adulthood, and 25% consider or engage in self-harm in adulthood. And those sorts of things are things that we shouldn't let scare us, but we should let it say they really need some intentional care that really speaks directly to a lot of the challenges that they face. And one of those specific challenges, we'll talk about this more a little bit later, is the challenge of grief and loss. There's a ton of grief and loss that comes when you are constantly changing environments, changing cultures, moving, especially if you're living in a third world country where you're exposed to more violence, more political corruption, even natural disasters, that sort of thing. All really impacts the TCK. And there are a number of studies that show that adverse childhood experiences, things that happen in our developmental years that are really difficult, the more of those you have, the more likely you are to struggle in adulthood. And so we know that when we're raising our kids with this lifestyle, if we're not being preventative and proactive about some of those things, that their trajectory, unfortunately, is really concerning. And so it's not, again, something to be scared about, but instead to say, here's the hope. You have the power, the ability, the intentionality to be able to raise healthy third culture kids, which is what my book is all about. But it just requires knowing some things about what a third culture kid is. Back to what I was saying about labeling them as a third culture kid. One of the things that I see a lot of, which is why my philosophy, my methodology is to keep the TCK piece of the identity as just a piece. So yes, you are a TCK is part of who you are. You also have this other piece that's from your passport country. You also have this other piece that's from this other country. You also have your school identity and your family identity, and all these different pieces make you who you are. What happens when we put TCK in the front and say, well, you're not completely all of these things. What you are is you are a TCK. That's your primary identity. What we see happens in adulthood for those kids is that they at some point usually repatriate, like we talked about, to their passport country. And at some point, that TCK piece of their identity, if that's been primary the whole time, all of a sudden feels like, oh no, I'm starting to lose that. I haven't been living a globally mobile life in, for me, 15 years. I have lived in my passport country. I bought a house in my passport country. Well, now, if that was my primary identity, then what? Who am I? The other side of it is that you start to make unhealthy decisions, and we see this a lot in young adult TCKs, unhealthy decisions to really cater to that category. So, for example, they'll start to do things or say things like, I could never have the same job for more than a year. TCKs don't do that. Or I could never be friends with somebody who's not a TCK. TCKs don't do that. And so they'll start making decisions based on the TCKs don't do that. And if I'm trying to be this primary identity, I need to keep doing things that keep that forefront for me, because otherwise, what am I and who am I? And so I think it's really important that we keep it in its place, keep it as one of the pieces of identity, and then give it the necessary care that it deserves, just like you would for other pieces of their identity as well.
Lauren, you brought, and everybody just feel free to pop in questions into the chat. So from what Lauren just said, please, I will, oops, not like that, let's see. But open the chat and fill in some questions. One thing I heard you say, which I kind of made a connection to, we raised our girls all since the time they were born up until 6th grade in third world countries. We were in Africa, Tanzania, Djibouti, Mongolia, then Indonesia. And some of what you talked about in terms of just different environment, yes. But the biggest thing that you talked about, which I can relate to as a mother, that I didn't understand until we got back to America, was that whole idea that even though we had been coming back every summer, our kids did feel a little bit different. And I remember 2 specific stories. One was when my daughter asked which football team we cheered for, because we didn't watch American football. So like, were we which football team did we cheer for? And the second was when my youngest said, "Oh, mommy, I feel different than everyone." So I do think as a parent, I didn't really get it. And even as an educator, because we learn about this theory as an international school teacher, but there is something about the experience of change and moving that our children may have that as a parent, I didn't really think was that important until they repatriated. Do you find that the difference between moving country to country and then when it does come time to repatriate back to the home country, or if there's 2 cultures there within the family, how does that all work?
Yeah, for sure. So it's typically the first time that a child who's old enough to understand, it's usually the first time that they're back in their passport country, or even in their passport country for the first time, that they realize how different they actually are. And so that's a really key transition point. And I really encourage parents to prep well for that and know what's coming and know how to help them through it, because it is often a surprise for them too. That, wait a second, I thought I would fit in here and I clearly don't. The same is true if you have parents from different passport cultures. The idea behind it that is true, whether it's one passport country or multiple, is these are supposed to be my people. This is my heritage. This is where I came from. And yet I don't feel like I am a part of that group, or they don't treat me as part of that group, or I don't know how to act in a way that I'm part of that group. I heard this great story that illustrated this, about this gal who'd grown up in Africa, and she, in this Tanzanian culture in Africa, was very outgoing, really talkative, really just bubbly. She was a bubbly person. Well, she went to visit her family in Russia because one of her parents was Russian. She went to visit her family there, and her whole family was saying, "You need to speak up. You are too quiet. You are too meek," which in Tanzanian culture, she wasn't. So there she was being told, you need to speak up. And then she went to visit the other side of the family. And I can't remember the culture that they were from, but she went to visit the other side of the family, and they said, you need to told her parents, you need to tell your daughter to quiet down. She talks way too much. She is being too over enthusiastic about things. She needs to calm down. That is not what women do here. And so it's just a really good example of her, that poor teenage girl wondering, how do I fit in any of these places when I'm clearly not doing the right thing in any of them, and I don't know how to do that. I feel most comfortable in this African culture that I don't look anything like I'm from, but these 2 places I clearly am missing something that's making me not feel like I belong there. And that becomes really confusing, especially for teenagers when they enter that situation.
And there's no one monolithic, way that we're talking about this, but each child is unique in their situation, in their context. Would anyone in the audience like to share an experience that they've had with their children and trying to fit in identity or belonging with what your family has experienced in the places that you've lived and the cultures that your family has? Oops. All right, sorry, my phone is on. Okay, well, if not, no problem. We'll go on to our next question. And our next question that we had from our audience, and I really apologize that my phone is making that loud
I
noise.
you purposefully turned on background music and I was really impressed.
Okay, yeah. No,
Wait,
I have,
this is great.
no, I have to put on my ringer really loud because when my husband calls, he says that my ringer isn't on. So I tried to change my ringer really loud. Okay, the second question we have is about some of us have chosen this life, but are accompanying our spouses on their next assignment. So we haven't chosen this life, but maybe our spouse has an assignment. So they're, taking us to this next place. How can we maximize the opportunities that this life can bring for our children? And what is our responsibility in this? And a lot of our participants that registered talked about maintaining relationships, maintaining friendships for our children, as well as the anxiety that goes into like that next move, knowing that they're moving again.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. It is really hard when you are the one who does not particularly want this life or want to go to the first place or the next place or this place. And so it is really, really difficult to think in that situation of not only do I not want to do this, but I'm worried that it's not going to be good for my kids and my family. One thing that's really important to look into and realize is that the TCK life is proven to bring so many benefits for children. And in adulthood, there are so many wonderful skills that they develop, everything from being really adaptable to we know that they have deeper abilities for empathy that cross cultures. So, for example, it is really in our DNA, which I won't say this is a good thing, but it's in our DNA that we easily empathize with people who look the same, think the same, and do life the same. We can put ourselves in their shoes and imagine what they're feeling easier than we can for somebody who looks different, thinks different, and does life different. Unfortunately, I wish that wasn't the reality. TCKs, though, have this really cool ability to empathize just as deeply with people who look different, think different, and do life different than them. And that is a really neat ability and makes them amazing in helping professions, in medical professions, anything where there's work with people, that is an amazing skill. So adaptability, they have that ability for empathy. They also have an amazing opportunity to have a really high emotional intelligence and resilience because they have been through so much that they have had to learn how to deal with those things. And either they learn how to deal with them really well or they don't. And so that's where you come in as a parent, is in a lot of these areas, you have to go through the hard things to reap those amazing benefits, unfortunately. It is through the challenges that the benefits come. And it's so critical that parents are fostering them toward the direction of those benefits when they go through the challenges instead of turning toward unhealthy coping mechanisms, all sorts of things that really are not helpful for our children. And it is a something that is not difficult. It just requires intentionality. So, for example, something really simple is helping your kids to use feelings words. So, when you're in a transition, how can you help them to accurately depict emotion and the things that they're feeling and why they're feeling them? When you use something really big that's like, you're sad because we moved. Yes, that's part of it. But are you just sad or are you sad and worried and anxious and afraid and whatever else. And are you just sad because we moved, or are you sad because you left your friends and you don't have anybody who knows you, and you feel like you lost your independence, and you feel like you don't know how to get around or where you would go to the doctor? What is tied up into that? And so a lot of these things that we can do to help our kids thrive overseas are giving them language, helping them to develop this emotional vocabulary, helping them to process grief and loss and their identity, and all these different aspects of the TCK life. And again, it's not complicated. It's just probably different than we grew up with, or than we would usually think to do, because we didn't live a TCK lives ourselves, maybe, or we're not familiar with it, or again, it wasn't your choice. You were going with a spouse. And so it's just something that you maybe haven't put as much thought and intentionality into. But being able to reap those benefits is something that only comes when we are intentional about helping our kids through this really complex, globally mobile life.
And from reading the book, Lauren, one of the best ways you talk about it, and one of the ways that I found in our family that has really helped, is talking about emotions, or creating space for emotions, and not just the happy emotions, but also kind of those difficult emotions.
Mhm.
And as a parent, this isn't something like I didn't grow up in a house. Well, first of all, I never moved. And second of all, I didn't grow up in a house where we talked about emotions. So this is a skill I've had to develop as a parent, right? Because oftentimes we'd move and I'd be like, oh, it's going to be fine. I just kind of wanted. And what I've learned is you really have to validate, like you were just saying, oh, so you're feeling really sad and worried to leave your friends, and give that space to that kind of emotion, and then helping our kids activate the problem solving that can help them work through that emotion. Yeah, definitely. And it looks like we have a question coming in. Do you think it's better to settle down in your home country as the kids get older, say in high school? Does this change or affect the outcomes?
So, if we're talking about high schoolers specifically, one kind of rule of thumb is that the younger kids are, the more their primary attachments are in your nuclear family. And that makes a significant difference when you're thinking about moving and that sort of thing. If you're moving with their primary attachments, the transition isn't going to be ripping them away from so much. Obviously, there are some things that are still difficult, but the younger that they are, the more those are their primary attachments. The older that they are, the more their primary attachments move outside the nuclear family, sometimes to the point where they wouldn't necessarily consider their parents or siblings close friends at that point in time, but their close friends are outside the nuclear family. And so that's kind of the underlying layer of why it's so difficult to move with older kids. One thing that I always recommend for families with high schoolers, and it kind of changes into the older high school stage, is to really bring them in on the decision. Now, if they're younger, or if you don't feel like you have a choice, I know, especially in military contexts, there may not be an option, but bringing them in on talking through the decision, talking through the pros and cons, saying, how do you feel about this? What are your thoughts? We want to hear them. It may not affect your outcome, but it is so important that they feel heard.
Oh.
And they can feel heard even if you make a different decision. And so it's important to invite them into that conversation. The other thing that I really encourage is, as far as you can, as much as you can with high schoolers, give them options.
Okay.
So yes, we have to move here. We don't have a choice, or we've decided that this is going to be the best thing, even if we were given a choice. Here are your options. Here are your school options. We're going to let you choose. Or here are the options for houses we would love for you to help us pick. Or here are the options for location within this context, even.
Okay.
Would you like to live more in the city, or more rural, or by the beach, or whatever it is? But trying to allow them to feel like they have control over something, because that is a really significant developmental stage in teenage years. And so to take that away from them in every context of life, not only are we moving to a foreign place, but you also have zero control over anything that happens in that place that we're moving to. It really can be detrimental. And so it's important that you give them the opportunity opportunity to make as many decisions as reasonably possible in that context. And if you do decide to move in those older years.
So you've said two things. You've said creating that space for emotions, to talk about
Yeah.
emotions, and then giving children choice and voice in what they can have an opportunity to control. And at the older years, that becomes even more important, that they have a sense of ownership over parts of their lives.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I've seen that in, because we were moving a lot when our kids were younger, making decisions about what toys we can take, or how you're going to decorate your room, those kind of things. Anybody else in the audience have ways that you've provided choice or given a sense of control to your kids as you're moving countries? Love to hear an example. Yeah. No problem. All right. Lauren, our last question had to do with COVID and the implications that COVID has had on transition, and how some families have had to leave very suddenly, and not their children haven't had a chance to say goodbyes to the people, places, and things that they love, or they've transitioned to a new place and kids are having a hard time making friends. How does this relate to the research that you've done and the support that you're giving the children and families that you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. I have worked with and debriefed so many families this last year. And one thing I'll just say at the get-go, every family needs a debrief after and after whatever it is you went through. And it's not even just for this season, but for prior to that, because what I talk a lot about and just wrote a book on is this concept of the grief tower. So the idea is that grief for anyone, not even just TCKs, grief during our developmental years stacks up like blocks on a tower, with every loss, every grief-inducing experience, every intense moment of fear, every season of depression or anxiety, every family crisis. That's another block on the tower. TCKs have an average of 25 blocks on their tower going into college. And what we see happen is that usually during those first few years of young adulthood, 18 to 24, that tower crashes and causes what's called complex PTSD, which has the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So it could be nightmares, it could be physical symptoms like having stomach issues or a lot of migraines. It can be a myriad of things. But the whole idea is that at some point, you cannot maintain a grief tower that's that tall. What has been seen with COVID, what I've seen a lot of, is that families had either a not very tall grief tower because maybe they hadn't lived globally mobile for very long, or their overseas life hadn't included many what we'd call little T traumas. And then all of a sudden COVID hit, and in 1 year, the tower went and just stacked up really quickly with so many blocks that are all encompassed in this COVID season. So maybe that was an evacuation. And within the evacuation, you had to say goodbye to everybody, or you didn't get to say goodbye to anybody. And you had to leave without even packing all the things that you would want to. There's so many pieces just in that leaving that would be blocks on the tower. And then you have school canceled. Okay, well, that's another block on the tower. Maybe the whole thing was a season of depression or anxiety for one of your children. So that would be something on the tower. Maybe in the midst of it, you had a family crisis. Maybe somebody did get sick. Maybe there was something else that happened that was a family crisis. And so you take this one COVID season, and it's likely that there are at least 2 or 3 blocks that have stacked up on your family's grief tower just in this season. And the thing about the grief tower is that it doesn't unstack itself. There isn't ever a point where it just dissolves and goes away and you get to start from ground zero and work your way up again. It's something that has to be intentionally unstacked. And most people either think that that's something that you have to do in a clinical setting with a counselor, or it's too much work, or it's just this really ambiguous, abstract idea of grief processing, but it's really not. It is something that you can do in your own family to unstack that tower, and that will set your kids up for so much more health in their teenage years, their young adult years, the rest of their lives, because they're not starting with that high stacked grief tower. So as we think about COVID, we need to think about what has that added on to a TCK's grief tower, and how is that impacting them and the family as a whole. I am really big on whole family unit care. So we know that the health of parents directly impacts the health of kids. So when we're debriefing, every debrief that I do is with the whole family, because it is so important for the whole family to have that level of care and to see how all those dynamics fit together within the family and everything like that.
And I mean, it's kind of scary, like thinking about a grief tower, to be honest. Like, it makes me feel guilty as a parent. But what I hear you saying is that it's just a reality. Like, hey, these things can add up. This is what, when we study adult TCKs, these are some impacts that we see. So what I'm trying to communicate, or I'm just trying to paraphrase, what I'm trying to communicate is that it's important that you, as a parent, that we know about these things so that we can have the family meetings where we talk about how we're feeling, where we're talking about, hey, what was a rose or a thorn for you today? Or what are you feeling? And then problem solve that as a family unit. And then probably do some celebration or positive things, and that kind of positive, what are we looking forward to next? What's the rituals that we have that can reinforce all the positive emotion that happens within the family. But to be aware as a parent that these things can stack up for our children, especially during COVID, and giving it time and space to talk about it as a family and not shy away from it. Because if that's what you're saying, Lauren, because I'm scared a little bit as a parent.
Well, don't be scared. Like I said, it's not rocket science. It's
right.
Just intentionality.
Yeah.
And one of the things, so what you're talking about is wonderful to have those conversations. What's the best thing about your day, the hardest part of your day, that sort of thing.
Right.
A lot of the time, though, what goes left undone is thinking back on something and how it impacted things after that. And that's where kind of debriefing comes in, or grief processing, thinking through that tower. Because a lot of the time in the moment, we don't know what we're feeling or why we're feeling it. We don't know how it's going to impact the next thing. It's just in that moment. And we may not that day list it as the worst part of my day.
Right.
But 6 months later, maybe you look back on it and go, oh man, I was underwater because of that and didn't realize it at the time. I know I do that all the time. I just go, and then look back and go, oh man, I was struggling in December or whatever, but I wouldn't have never said that in December. So it's important to do both, to do it in the moment, in the day, but then to also regularly. So I advise annual short debriefs, and then every 4 years doing a full 2-day debrief. And really checking in on what happened in the last year. What were the hard things that happened? What were those losses? What were those intense moments of fear for us? And let's process. So the processing questions that I kind of base all this processing on, and that can happen in a million different ways. You can process verbally, you can process with art, you can go on a walk and process while you're walking, you could process while you're exercising. As long as you're not listening to a podcast at the same time, that doesn't count. That's stress relief, but not grief processing. When you're grief processing, you're thinking through, what were the emotions that I felt in that season or when that event took place? How did it feel in my body? That's a really good thing to think about and to walk your kids through. TCKs, we know, tend to disconnect body from emotion pretty early on, because the idea is that it is sometimes an expectation that they look excited, act excited, are really happy about this really great adventure that they're about to go on, that all the other kids would want to be them. And it's really talked up. And so something inside their brain says, if I'm going to please the people around me, my face needs to show something different than I'm feeling. And that's something that has to be really intentionally retaught, is how can you connect those things again? And so one of the things for grief processing is talking about, how did it feel in your body? Think about that. Let's look at that, because it looks like maybe every time you have a block on your grief tower, you also have a stomach ache. That's something that's good to know.
Mhm.
And then how did that affect my thought processes and actions going forward? So, how did that event make me think about things or my actions going forward? A great one with the evacuations that have happened, maybe for your thought processes, now you are scared to settle in anywhere. Now you're scared of any time that it's like, ooh, this is nice and calm. All of a sudden your heart starts racing because you're thinking, well, what if something else happens? Maybe it affects your actions. You don't have as much stuff, or you decide, I'm going to make sure that I can pack everything really quickly if we ever need to again, that sort of thing. So, how did it affect actions and thought processes? And then, do I need help to move forward in a healthy way? And
Mhm.
so, that's another thing to think about is this block on the tower so big that we need to process it outside our family too? And that's something to consider. But those are kind of the processing questions to go through for each block on the grief tower with your kids.
Okay. So what happens if, how do you do it if you wanted to do that within your family and you didn't know how to do it? The
Yes,
Grief Tower book helps us do it?
the
I
grief
mean,
tower
that's
book is
okay.
why that's why I wrote it, is so that
Okay.
can process this with their kids within their family and it doesn't feel scary. It might
Right.
be a little bit scary, but at least there's a list of here's step one, step two, what to say, what to not say, like that
Yeah.
sort of things in there.
And I mean, I'll be a little vulnerable here. We had to do this with our family because my husband deployed to Iraq our last year in Jakarta, and my daughters and I had a really, I thought it was going to be okay. But it was a hard year. And there were some places where I think, like you said, our kids often do as well as we're doing. And I was really struggling. And, you know, my daughters and I, we really had to go through some processes to understand what happened during that year to kind of help us heal and move forward. And so I think that's okay too, right? It's not always easy and it's not always like super adventure, but at the same time, you'll become stronger when you do kind of reflect and unpack some of those blocks and and recognize, like you're saying, the emotion, where you're feeling it in the body, the thought processes that go on. That builds that resilience that you need for that, whatever the next challenge is that we face as adults or our kids face as well. So these skills really are lifelong skills that we're teaching our kids.
Absolutely. I just worked
Mhm.
with a group of college age TCKs who, for all intents and purposes, had not unstacked the grief tower. They were really
Mhm.
struggling. And so part of what I was talking to them about and telling them is that this is going to be something that is going to help you empathize well with other people. If you come
Mhm.
across the ways that you cope with this high stacked grief tower, you're either going to pass those ways on to other people, or you get to unstack it and then pass that on to other people of how do you do this grief processing in a healthy way. And a lot of them were prepping to go into helping professions. And so I was telling them, you cannot help these people in something that you haven't done yourself.
Mhm.
And if they're coming with grief and loss, and most people are who come to seek the help of a professional helping professional,
Right.
you can't be of service to them if you haven't done your work.
Yes.
And
Yes.
there's a high grief tower that needs to be unstacked before
Mhm.
you can provide excellent care. So
Mhm.
it really is a lifelong skill. And I mean, we can even talk about it generationally. We know that high emotional intelligence and resilience passes generationally, both directions, either the bad side or the good side, and you
Mhm.
can break those cycles. But how much better is it to get to a healthy place and then pass that on to your kids?
Yeah. Yeah, I feel thankful that we've done that work as a family because I think it's made us stronger for sure. It's not easy. Yeah. From what we've just heard, if, please put your questions that you have, your comments that we have. We have a, few more minutes. I wanted to share, one of the panelists shared when we were talking about how we help our children, especially middle schooler and high schoolers, have that sense of ownership and choice. And the participant shared how when they went on their look-see visit, they took the kids along. So they got to see what the middle school and high school looked like. They also participated in the home search where they were going to live. And another participant talked about how they did move back to their home country a couple years
I
before.
allow my creativity to flow through me freely.
Sorry, Kim, I think your microphone's on.
Begin to deeply.
I can mute. Okay. And how they did move back to their home country before they started college, and that they believe as parents that reentry before transitioning to college helped them kind of go through that culture shock of repatriation before having to move to a more independent life in college. Yeah, so thank you for sharing. Great. Anybody else want to share something that they're thinking about, something that they've connected to, or they're still wondering about, related to what we've talked about, identity and part of the identity of your child and third culture kids, or part of looking at how we support our kids with the by being able to talk about emotions, by creating space for our family to debrief over, challenging events that have happened. Anyone want to share anything that they're thinking of at this point? Or have any other questions that have come up from what we've talked about so far today? I'll give it a little teacher.
I would like, could I ask something?
Yeah, go for it.
I found it's the first time I hear about this concept of the grief tower. Is it something in psychology, or is it something you described? Like this?
Yeah, this is my methodology and concept. It's now being used by over 60 organizations and companies. So you'll probably hear of it elsewhere, but I'm the source, I guess you could say.
And where did it come from, Lauren? Was it from the research that you were looking at, from your work with children and families, or how did that all come together?
Yeah, so from my work with families, for sure, is how it originated. And there just hasn't been a great way of explaining why TCK grief is so significant. And so that was something that I started using. To be completely honest, it was not something that I intentionally was thinking I need to come up with a way to do this. I just started, I'm a big object lesson person. I'm big on practical, like, how do I explain this in a way that makes sense? And so I was just starting to explain to families, this is why this is so important. I mentioned it in my first book. And after I mentioned it in my first book, I had so many people contacting me saying, we want to hear more about the grief tower. And I was thinking, I haven't thought much more about the grief tower. And so I really started to unpack it more, and especially using psychology, using research we know about TCKs, that sort of thing, and kind of grow the concept. And so that's what turned into the book, The Grief Tower. But it was not an intentional process. It just kind of slowly has grown into a methodology.
Great. Any other questions? Well, I guess to end our time together, we're all parents here. Some of the people that are participating today are TCKs themselves. If we could walk away from this conversation, what would be the one message you would want to communicate, as a child who grew up as a third culture kid as part of their identity? And as you work with parents and families, what's the one message or one takeaway you would want us to have from our discussion today?
So the first thing will be from a parent's perspective. So as a parent, it is so easy to feel guilty about what you're doing or not doing or that sort of thing. So the very first thing is you are likely an amazing parent doing things really well. And that's the thing that we find kind of interesting and really tricky about third culture kids, is that monocultural kids, which somebody just asked a question.
I'm sorry, I just saw that comment. great.
Monocultural kids
Yeah.
who have a high stacked grief tower, so who have a lot of little t traumas throughout their life, they usually come from really unhealthy families. So families of low socioeconomic status who have drugs in the home, or really broken families, incarcerated relative, domestic violence situations. Those are the kind of families that we see monocultural TCK or monocultural individuals come from, who have a high grief tower. Healthy families who are monocultural have about a 5-block grief tower, as opposed to 20 to 25 of TCKs. So that's kind of the difference. So the point being, you are likely a very healthy family, wonderful parents, really intentional parents, that sort of thing. And so for you, it's not a huge shift. It's just a tweaking and an intentionality about how exactly you're doing it. So how do you address these things that you've never dealt with before? One thing that I'll say from the perspective of someone who was a TCK living that life is to take it seriously. It is something that really is significant, and it really does impact your kids' lives. And so it's really important to not let it be something that scares you, especially to the point of just being paralyzed because you don't know what to do, but to know about it and take it seriously, and then be aware and intentional about what you're doing with it.
And I think too, Lauren, each child is different, right? Each of your children will be needing you to show up in different ways for them, right?
Absolutely. Every child is unique, and every TCK is unique. So that's another reason why the TCK label, it should not be used as this means your child does this. No. It's very broad. Here's what we see in the general population of TCKs. Your kid's going to be different from their sibling and from another TCK and that sort of thing.
Great. Well, Lauren, if people wanted to learn more about the work that you do with children, with families, with your writing, is there a way that they can learn more from you or what you do?
Absolutely. So my website is tcktraining.com. I'll also just give you a preview of a couple of resources that might be helpful. So a couple of things that I have I have a family curricula for ages 4 to 12 and then 13 to 18 that comes with a teen workbook. And this is a way for families to be able to talk through and work through TCK challenges, part of what happens in the mobile life, that sort of thing. And it's a really easy way to do it because you have it all there for you. It's activities, crafts, all that sort of thing. Lots of things to do as a whole family. So that curricula is available. The other thing is I offer workshops all the time. So there are tons and tons of workshops on parenting TCKs. Everything is super practical. And I have a subscription for parents for all those workshops. So it's only $17 a month. And so it ends up being a really inexpensive way to just make sure that you have lots of information, as much or as little of it as you want to take from it. But that workshop option is really helpful, I know, to a lot of parents. So those would be the two things. I also do debriefing, like I mentioned. So if your family hasn't had one yet, or you're interested in that, I do that both virtually and in person. So
and your books on Amazon.
They're both available on Amazon and Kindle. And the first one is Raising Up a Generation of Healthy Third Culture Kids, and the other one is The Grief Tower. So those are available as well.
Great. And from reading Raising Up a Generation of Healthy Third Culture Kids, I can totally testify to how you're very practical. You give us really great exercises that you can easily do with your child in a lot of the different areas that we talked about today. So I really appreciate it. As a teacher, it's great. It's like, oh yeah, that's how you can do it. It's awesome. So wonderful. Well, I'm so happy for those of you that joined us today. If you're listening on a recording, I hope you found value and support and ideas and resources. For me, I'm feeling a little like edgy, like scared a little bit, but I don't think it's to be scared. I think it's to be like, hey, this is just part of understanding a globally mobile life, and just an additional awareness and intentionality to supporting my children's social and emotional well-being. And I really appreciate the time that you took to speak with us today, Lauren, and the care and the commitment that you have to children and families. If you would like to continue to have these kind of parent discussions, what I like about this is it's not sponsored by like the US Embassy, or it's not sponsored, you know, it's just parents who care about their kids in a globally mobile life. You can like my Facebook page, which is Learning to Flourish. I can put the link to my newsletter, which will give you, you know, future conversations that we can have. And I just appreciate everyone who's here to care about kids and their children. So thank you, everyone.
Absolutely. I do want to say one last thing
Yes,
before
yes,
everyone goes,
yeah.
and that is to what you were saying about being scared. So another thing I offer is a family care package where I talk to you every single month, or somebody on my team talks to you every month. And so if you feel like you just need extra hand holding and somebody to be like, all right, so this month, here's what you're going to talk about and work on. That is something that I offer too, specifically for families who feel like I am not sure how to do this. This kind of scares me a little bit. That's a great option. So just so you know, that's available too.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, everyone who participated. And we will see you next time. Bye-bye. Stop recording.